You're watching Taste of Victory.
Digimon is a ridiculously cheap card game. With a generous amount of super rare hits in the average booster box, the price of a deck's boss monster is never really too high unless it's a secret rare in a side set or from a really old box now that the game is nearing 4 years old. But exactly how cheap is it? And how does that stack up against the big three and other card games? I thought a fun way to look at this would be to take the 3 best competitive decks at the time of writing and compare that against the other game's top 3. While I think the best way to get into any game is to start with what you think is the coolest and simple, I can't deny that many players like myself just want to dive into the best of the best broken stuff right away and start learning from there as a starting point. So today we'll be comparing against Yu-Gi-Oh, Pokemon, Magic, and One Piece as a popular game outside of the big three. For Digimon, since this is being written, and hopefully is edited out by then, during the English BT13 format, we will be using Shine Greymon, Hunters, and War Greymon as our Digimon base points based on their representation and conversion rate at the most recent Digimon regionals. A similar deciding method will be used for the other game's 3 decks. The method for calculating prices will be based on adding all pieces of the deck to cart on TCG Player and optimizing it as of September 1st, 2023. While I recognize you can ask around Discords and Facebook groups for better deals and bulk discounts, and that's how I personally go about getting cards usually, we're tackling this from the perspective of someone new just trying to hop into the game for the first time and wants a simple and guaranteed streamlined way to get the cards without negotiating. No man, I can't go $5 lower, this is already 75% off! Shine Greymon is currently the most popular deck in Digimon. Being able to quickly Digivolve for cheap or straight up free with his tamers and being able to do additional checks with those tamers makes this deck a consistent monster. Totaling the typical build average from multiple top 16 deck lists, we get a total of about $156 on TCG Player. The price is bloated by a One of Ruin mode who is $50 on his own because he was a secret rare in a side set. This is actually pretty shockingly high by Digimon standards, so much so that I had to double check I had everything right. By taking a deeper dive, it seems like a lot of old cards have driven up the price since Greymon keeps getting new support and Bandai has not reprinted many of the old cards. Looking at Hunters as our second baseline for Digimon, we see a pretty big difference. Hunters is a deck that can do its own game plan and not worry about the opponent too much in the early game, since its Digimon with save getting deleted only benefits it, and the boss monster comes out and gets around nearly every single protection in the game. I think legit only 2 cards protect against the rest of Dramon's superior mode's removal in the entire game. Hunters lists are usually set in stone because a lot of the effects specify which Digimon you have to run, so tossing the average list into TCG Player, we get a total of $50.37. Less than half of Shine, and for a regional winning deck, a great entry point for new players. Interestingly, the price almost exclusively comes from the Superior Mode and Quartzmon, as the actual core is made up of penny cards. Finally, for our last Digimon deck that is topping well, we have Black War Greymon X. This deck is insane for being able to cheat evolution costs and easily blow up your opponent's Digimon or Tamers, giving it a good, almost anti-meta matchup into a lot of the top decks. The occasional DP minus protection doesn't hurt either in this meta. This deck comes out to an average of $128. There's a lot of old cards and promos or starter deck cards that add up quickly. Funny enough, this is probably the most expensive the top decks have been in Digimon for a while. For example, of the regionals that have happened so far, 12 Black War Greymon have placed in the top 16, going off EggmanEvents.com, ignoring the August 16th Gen Con regional since it was a unique format. While just barely below it at 10 participants is Blue Flare, which totals to $83 average. But anyways, the exciting part, how does that compare to other games? If I wanted to sell out Digimon right now, would my meta decks be able to get me any other game's meta decks? Let's start with Pokemon. Pokemon has a fairly aggressive reprint policy, often putting meta staples in tins as promos not too long after their debut, in themed products, or straight up as a purchasable deck in battle boxes around 6 months to a year later. Being the biggest casual audience, a lot of product is open and sold in search of alt arts too. So Pokemon has developed a positive reputation as the cheapest card game, so let's see how accurate that is. Pokemon has the unbelievable tool Limitless TCG, which tracks lists and gives you an accurate, real-time price check on the list. Mew VMAX has had a long life of successful tournament representation and recently won Worlds 2023, Pokemon's most prestigious and stacked tournament. Limitless gives us a real-time total of $62.33. However, it seems like the site isn't taking into account that for a Seal Stone is about $14 and the list run 3. It lists 3 as $17, so maybe it was at the time, but subtracting that and adding in the actual cost of 3 Seal Stones, which would be $14 times 3, brings the correct total up to $88.41. Looking at every other Mew VMAX in top 16, they were also running 3 Forest Seal Stones. So it seems pretty necessary, but if you want to cut down on it, it does leave the deck able to be built anywhere from $44 to $90. so while Huntress wouldn't be able to buy us this deck, Shine and Black World Greymon would. Next up for well-performing Pokemon lists is Gardevoir X. I personally bought this deck myself to hop back into the game and can attest to it being cheap. This deck placed second at Worlds with a very standard list. Limitless seems to be having the Forest Sealstone error again, so I double checked all the prices are still accurate, and they are. Correcting for one Sealstone again, we get a total of $64.19. This is a widely topping list, second at Worlds, and still expected to be good after a deck it's weak to is introduced into the game. All of our Digimon decks would be able to afford us this, and frankly, it's insane a tier 1 deck can hit this cheap in a card game. Shout out to Pokemon. And finally for Pokemon, we have Lost Zone Giratina, a crazy consistent, easy to pilot deck that's been finding ways to adapt to the meta every single set. It has wide representation and finished third at Worlds 2023. Luckily, there is no price correction to account for here this time. Giratina Lost Box comes out to a total of $80.69. Nice. So while Huntress couldn't get us this deck, the other two Digimon meta decks would. Pokemon comes out as the overall cheaper game and more in line with Digimon's tier 1.5 to tier 2 decks than its top meta decks recently. Next up, let's take a small detour from the big three and move to Bandai's other card game that's taking the hobby by storm right now. Being the hype new card game everyone is trying out, I'm not expecting this to age well, but if it retains the hype, who knows? Currently, the best performing decks are Whitebeard, Zoro, and Law. Manually tossing everything into TCG Player, Whitebeard comes out to $165, and it's only been going up every time I check to keep the script up to date. When I started writing this video, it was $143. This is based on Philip Lai's second place Carta Magica Online Treasure Cup list. One deck in for One Piece, and only Shine can afford us this deck right now. And that's assuming you didn't just decide to cut the Ruin mode, which plenty of decks have also topped without it. Next up is Zoro, based on Cross AI's winning deck list at the Carta Magica Online Treasure Cup. Zoro is quickly rising as a competitor for best deck, and its price reflects it. It currently averages out to $144 on TCG Player. Marco from Pillars of Strength and Promo Gordon skyrocket the price as 3 of, starting at $13.50 and $10 in the case of Gordon. From there, a lot of the price is mostly made up from old starter deck cards or promos with the actual bulk of cards from the main set usually being pennies. Bandai has a long-standing history of making good cards promos, unfortunately. Of our Digimon decks, only Shine can afford us this deck, assuming you opted to get the Ruin mode. Let's see if the last widely placed One Piece deck changes things up. Our final One Piece deck we're looking at is Law, a complicated deck to use with lots of combos. This is based on Daniel Hansen's top 16 deck list at the Carta Magica Online Treasure Cup. Tossing it into TCG Player totals $190. I had to double take and check this was right, and yeah, the main playmaker Law is $13.50 at the lowest, and then you also need 3 Zoro, which are $14 at the lowest. Then there's a couple random cards for $3 to $5 here and there, and it all adds up really quick. And Law is definitely the third best deck out of these three, falling off a little bit more every set with how much harder he has to work against new threats. So here we finally have our first deck Digimon meta decks can't afford us. This also seems to be the average range of regional winning One Piece decks, while Digimon is ranging anywhere from $15 to $160. New game hype with the promise of incredible rewarding pricing is definitely a factor in One Piece's prices, but for how popular it is, I think it's actually in a pretty healthy spot in terms of price of entry, especially since you have plenty of cheaper playable high tier 2 decks like Nami and Croc. Next, we return to the big three with Yu-Gi-Oh! A game with no rotation, old cards come in and out of the meta rapidly shifting prices. Similarly, Yu-Gi-Oh's meta shifts very quick. Hopefully this video isn't outdated in a week. Looking over recent tournament results, we will be looking at Pearly, Dragon Link, and Kashtira. All lists are taken from the recent top 8 Indianapolis WCQ 2023. Yu-Gi-Oh! Utilizes generic staples at high amounts in decks, which in turn makes these cards very valuable and thus expensive. However, it can be argued this is a positive as you can swap them between a majority of the metagame's decks and only have to pick up the core for less. But it does potentially create an initial barrier of entry for new players, so let's get started with Dragon Link. I've played Yu-Gi-Oh! Before, and even I wasn't ready for this, probably because I was a scrub that only ever picked up meta decks formats late after a nerf for Megaton. Dragon Link on TCG Player average totals $389, accounting for the cheapest print of each card. By far the most expensive game in our video so far. None of our Digimon meta decks come close to affording us this. We barely do if we were to sell all three in exchange for this one deck. While there are a couple expensive cards in the main deck like a secret rare boss monster, the majority of the price comes from the extra deck with cards like Chaos Angel starting at $55. But as mentioned, some like Access Code Talker can at least be used in plenty of decks. Next up, we got Pearly, an adorable little deck that's been topping plenty at recent events in spite of a preventative hit. This deck comes out to a whopping $409 on TCG Player. Staples of the deck like Pearly and My Friend Pearly range from $18 to $25 and are mandatory 3-ofs in the deck. Multiple of these alongside the expensive staples add up quickly. Another deck Digimon can't even come close to affording us with its top decks. And finally, for Yu-Gi-Oh! We have Kashtira, the hotness people were terrified of taking over the game after Teal Elements were hit with no preventative measure for cash. Our final Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck totals out to $551 at the time of writing. None of our Digimon decks end up being able to afford us these cards. not even if we sold all 3 to try and afford Kashira. Yu-Gi-Oh! Ended up surprising me with how expensive it's gotten as someone that usually just played casually with fluffles, despots, and whatever other pile of cards I had. My dumbass thought the Melodious lock was broken at the time. But with the storied history that makes people nostalgic for it, cards that never rotate out, and many secret rares per box, it makes sense how this could add up for certain decks. It funnily enough works the opposite way too, where you can get whole decks for like $5 like the aforementioned Despots or Dynamists. Finally, we move on to our last game of the big 3. Magic the Gathering. I hate Sorry, I shouldn't do that, that's not fair. But this was by far the weirdest part of making this video. Every time I would ask what's the most played format, I would get a different answer because there's so many. Eventually, Commander was the most commonly repeated answer, and that does seem to be correct, but it's a singleton format that inherently changes the way you go about getting cards and deck building, and it's more for casual fun nights with friends over the kitchen tabletop. Standard is the competitive format equivalent to other games' default competitive formats, and Modern is their equivalent to Expanded or Unlimited, which I have to say isn't very intuitive at all for a name. There's nothing modern about needing to get 20-year-old cards. Definitely prefer Pokemon and Tepin's naming conventions of Expanded and Unlimited. For this video, since we use the standard format for the other games, in many cases being the only format those games have, we'll be doing the same for Magic the Gathering. Luckily, since Magic the Gathering is the biggest, longest running card game in the West, there are tons of useful resources to quickly see the top decks and their price breakdown. Side note, hey, this is Tasty RC from the future, but I went to take the screenshot for the video of MTG Goldfish, and the standard format is completely different from the last time I checked. Some of the decks are still in the same spot, but like Mono Red Aggro is dirt cheap and the most represented deck now when it wasn't like that just like 3 days ago, so I guess Magic format shifts just as fast as Yu-Gi-Oh, so I guess it's a lot cheaper now with Mono Red Aggro being in there. So I guess take this next section with a pinch of salt, because prices can change so quickly apparently. Hopefully the rest of it still holds up, well researched, thanks. However, these lists seemingly use TCG Player Direct to grab these totals, so it's not necessarily the cheapest option on the site. In double checking, this is usually $5 to $10 range off of the higher priced cards, so subtract around $20 to $30 from the final total for these decks. Looking at MTG Goldfish's standard meta page, we see that the 3 most represented decks are Dimir Midrange, Esper Midrange, and Esper Control. Dimir Midrange averages out to about $436. This price is largely made up from Sheoldred being a 4 of almost $70 card. From there, the price isn't too bad with lots of cheap cards, and the next highest pricing being $14. Such is the nature of the chase card of a set being viable. We hit a wall again where our Digimon decks wouldn't be able to buy us this deck, not even if we sold all 3 of our meta decks to try and pick this up. Second is the Spur Midrange, telling a similar story at $500. While there's no outrageously expensive rare card on this list, there is a ton of pricey ones that can add up quick, ranging from $5 to $16. And of course, the $16 is a 4 of. Once again, way out of our price range. But maybe the third Magic the Gathering deck and final deck of this video can turn things around. MTG Goldfish lists the third most represented deck as Esper Control, taking the previous deck we just saw and taking a different spin on it, opting to focus on the Wandering Emperor, your 4 of, as your main and only Planeswalker. This deck does bring the total down to $397, but that's still crazy out of our range. To be fair, since this is a variation on a similar deck we already looked at, we can look at the next most represented deck in the Magic the Gathering standard metagame, since otherwise this would be like using 3 different builds of Black Royal Greymon as our Digimon benchmark. The fourth listed deck at MTG Goldfish is Celsnia Enchantment at $178, a much more reasonable range that we can at least reach by selling 2 of our Digimon decks. But a singular deck of ours doesn't price match, so we need to sell 2. It seems like the nostalgic legacy games have a much higher barrier of entry, while Pokemon seems to keep it down with aggressive reprints and a ton of its product being opened by people that aren't interested in playing the game, so they sell lower rarities to fund the search for the higher rarities. This was actually really interesting and eye-opening to dive into. Pokemon is by far the cheapest game on the market right now. Digimon is second, followed by One Piece, Magic the Gathering, then Yu-Gi-Oh! Out of the games we looked at today with our criteria. Tasty from the future again. So you just saw all that, but as you can see now, the most up-to-date screenshot I have of standard metagame is Mono Red Aggro is an $82 deck and is like the most represented, so you can actually get it pretty cheap right now. Shout out to Magic. While Digimon has done reprints, it's starting to hit the age of a game where old cards are still very much good in multiple decks, and as such, the entry price of the game is rising. The $50 to $80 range represented by Hunters and Blue Flare is representative of what the average deck for price used to look like a few sets ago. Now, decks like Shine use so many different Greymon cards that the total is all over the place. We do have a reprint set coming out soon though, so that should help a couple of decks at least, and hopefully we start getting more meta cards as participation prices and easily accessible promos to further bring costs down. However, after looking at today's other games, it's pretty crazy how Digimon is still fairly cheap in comparison. One Piece and Digimon both offer a competitive card game with depth and exploration at an affordable price outside of the big three. The new game hesitation likely plays into this, as not everyone will be fully on board until they prove they have the sticking power, and people that got in for a flip and profit may have already done their business and moved on to the next game. So with not as insane of a demand as the big three, there's plenty of cards to go around keeping prices down. Although the popularity of One Piece as a game and a brand is reflected in One Piece being the more expensive game between Digimon and One Piece from our criteria today. Now some people might say, tasty, of course the big three will always have higher prices. They have way more demand from their player base because they have a bigger player base. But that's not always necessarily true. A new game could come out with awful secret rare policies, short prints, or very hard to find promos, skyrocketing the price of their decks over the big three. So I'm glad we got to see here today that that's not necessarily the case for any of the new games from Bandai. Yes, there is an unfortunate issue with constantly printing good cards as promos, but thankfully so far none of them are at skyrocketing ridiculous prices, and they have been routinely reprinted in some cases, like the Agumon DP bonus promo. So I am happy to see that these new games are generous to new players out of the gate. That'll be all for today. Just thought this would be a fun little experiment to do, and it was. I hope you guys found the video useful, and maybe it helps you pick up what you want to play next. I had a lot of fun. Let me know if you would like to see more stuff like this in the future, and until that next time in the future, I'll see you. Remember to stay hungry until you get a taste of victory.